by raising charitable support at every level. It's my job to tell you that no contribution is too little or too big. Since 2006, more than 21 million has been raised, and more than 5,500 people and institutions have donated to help forest preserves do more. Our goal is to double these numbers by 2025 so we can support the preservation's 31,000 acres. Yes, the preserve is the largest landowner in Lake County. Now, over the past year, the preserves have taken on a new meaning for our residents. When the pandemic began, use of the preserves skyrocketed. In 2020, visitation to the forest preserves increased an average of 70% over the previous year. I mean, people come for exercise, for their mental health, and to socialize safely, and sometimes just get away from their families a little bit too. However, even if we don't set foot in them, the forest preserves are always working for us. They store carbon, clean the air, provide summer cooling, support the greatest diversity of plants and animals in Illinois, and clean our lakes, rivers, and groundwater, and I can go on and on. Now, the Lake County Forest Preserves is here for the public every day, year-round, open sunrise to sunset, and sometimes beyond, if you want to go for a late ski trip when we have snow. And there's lots of ways to get involved. So I've been involved with the preserves for, I can't believe I'm going to date myself, for some 20 years, from volunteering to now on the board. I donate my time and my resources because the preserves are what make living in Lake County special to me. They're a place to both connect with others for fun times like the new beer garden at Independence Grove, a place to challenge myself with kayaking and biking. And this is probably what I do most, is to center myself and connect with nature. I'm the person that you probably see at the crack of dawn in the preserves walking with my golden retriever Butter, who's sitting here heavy breathing. That is not me, that's the dog. She usually manages to swing her tail into every single burr bush she can while we're walking. So it's not totally pleasurable all the time for me, but it is for her. So tonight, let's move to what we're gonna see. So this evening's webinar, we are gonna share a few examples about how the foundation helps the forest preserves do more, specifically around planting and caring of Keystone Species, the majestic oak tree. These beautiful heroes of the Lake County landscape are not just essential to the wildlife that depends on them, they are also powerhouses of climate change resiliency. Climate change is a global challenge, but you may not know all that we're doing right here in Lake County to respond. Ty Kovacs, our executive director, and Jim Anderson, director of natural resources, are going to share specific examples of how we are working to protect air quality in the face of challenging climate conditions through working to restore some of the oak tree community distribution that has been lost here in Lake County. One significant project is focused on the woodlands along the Southern Des Plaines River, including Granger Woods, which is near and dear to my heart as a longtime Granger team member. I'd like to now introduce you to Jim Anderson, Director of Natural Resources, to tell us more about oaks. Jim?
Thank you, Renee, and welcome everybody. It gives me great pleasure to talk to you about oak trees. As you know, we have looked at oaks for a very long time in this region. In fact, oaks have been around for like 125,000 years, and then they went away for a while during the glaciated period, and then they came back as the glaciers receded. Oak dominated communities started to arise, as well as prairie, savanna, and woodland. So over this time, they have become what we call keystone species. And a keystone species is something that the entire ecosystem depends upon. So these oaks within this oak ecosystem are of major importance in maintaining the regional biodiversity. Not only do the large number of oak species by themselves contribute to community richness, they also are known to provide food and support for a substantial number of wildlife species. And so what I'd like to do is a little bit, the structure of our oak woodlands are very unique, and they really provide for a diverse herbaceous understory and a whole suite of species. In the Chicago region, there are about 20 oak species. Across the United States, there's about 90, and worldwide, there's about 500. And they can live up to 240 to 300 years old in this region. And we have many of those in our forest preserves. Many people go out and try to find what we call specimen trees. And one of the things I really like doing is getting people out there and finding a tree that we can hug And so it takes 3 or 4 people to make it to the huggable stage. So huggable trees are very important. And so one of the things I'd like to let you know is that oaks are divided into 2 different groups. There's the white oak group, and these are typically oaks that have rounded lobes, and they include the bur oak, the white oak, swamp white oak, and some parts of the region, chinkapin. The other side is red oaks, and they have pointed lobes. And so these are called pin, hills, black, red, and shingle. And now I'd like to talk to you about why oaks are such an important keystone species. And I'm going to come from the habitat side of it. And I'm going to start with the roots. The root system of an oak tree is just as large as the crown of the tree. Oak roots don't really go too far, too deep around here because we have a unique clay layer that's left over from the glaciers. This is the last place the glaciers touched in the state of Illinois. And so along Lake Michigan and along the Des Plaines River Valley, we're experiencing very shallow clay soils. So about 30 inches down. So the roots tend to grow out. And those roots growing out have fungi, soil arthropods, and they're all abundant in the root system. And the tree roots and bacteria act together to allow the tree to take up food. And as the bacteria are there, the arthropods eat them, the fungi eat them. So there's a whole ecosystem that's under the ground. The trunk of the tree provides holes for nesting for squirrels, owls, wood ducks, and other species. The trunk also provides habitat for lichens and mosses. Everybody knows about the north side of the oak tree. That's where the moss grows. The bark is also important. Many woodpeckers, nuthatches, and other species use the insects under the bark for food. And we also know that bats nest under the rough and loose bark. The leaves, which everybody tends to have to rake this time of year, but those leaves are critically important. They're used by insects, both when they are alive and when they die back. In fact, during my undergraduate studies, I had an invertebrate biologist show me many species of spider that curled up oak leaves to make a home out of. But those leaves also fall, and they create fuel for our prescribed burns, which are really important in regulating our oak community. The flowers, the oak tree flowers in the spring, right during spring bird migration, and the birds feed on these flowers. Squirrels raising their young use the flowers. Caterpillars and larvae of moths are on the tree. Butterflies and insects appear with many animals to feed upon them. And even the bees use the pollen of the oak leaves. So the flowers are really, really important. And then another aspect that's out there is the acorns. We all know about these. Each tree in its lifetime can generate up to 10 million acorns. Now, only 10% of those acorns turn into trees. So we lose a lot of acorns to food. But there's a lot of animals that feed on those acorns, including deer, turkeys, squirrels, and many insects lay their eggs in acorns. If you go out and collect acorns, drop them in the water, the ones that float are good. The ones that are sink likely have some larva inside of them. Blue jays also love acorns, and so do woodpeckers. The jays are so fond of the acorns, they tend to hide them. And unlike the squirrels, who also bury them, they tend to forget where they are, but the blue jays are really good at remembering where they stashed them and feed on those throughout the winter. And those acorns that are forgotten, they grow up into new oak trees. I have a bur oak in my backyard and a red oak in the front, and I have about 5 or 6 brand new oaks coming up around my house. Even when the oak tree dies, it provides significant habitat for nesting, foraging, and various insects. When the tree falls down, it is slowly recycled by a plethora of organisms that take their time recycling the tree back into the soil. So this forms this complete cycle of a keystone species. And just to wrap it up here really quick, a couple of quick facts about oaks. There's Dennis, I'm forgetting his last name, Laurie, I believe, indicated that there's 530 types of caterpillars that use oak trees. There's 40 different bird species that are highly dependent upon oaks, along with all the migratory species. There's about 31 mammals, And overall, there are approximately 2,300 animals associated with oaks. But if you really think through the whole cycle of the oak, from a seedling to falling down and degrading back into the earth, there's about 4,000 species that are used on oaks. So since oaks are a keystone species, the Forest Preserve, in partnership with Morton Arboretum, developed the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan to address the decline in oak communities. And that's this slide you see here. And I'm going to pass it on to Ty to continue on the conversation. Ty, you're on mute.
Thank you, Jim. And again, I'm Ty Kovach. I'm the executive director for the Forest Preserve District here in Lake County. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Today we're talking about the oak ecosystem, but I think it helps to talk just a little bigger picture about the district initially, and that that's what our authorization is, and that we're authorized to acquire land to protect it in perpetuity, and then restore it as close as possible to its natural state for the purpose of education and passive recreation. And so in that, more specifically, the restoration piece, and we do a lot of different types of restoration, but today we're just talking about the oak ecosystem recovery plan. And on this, a little bit, but just a little more, expound a little bit further. Since 1890, 88% of the oak communities have been lost in Lake County. And so that's why it's come up to 187,000 acres in 2010 to 23,000 acres. So it's really changed drastically from that pre-European settlement in the area. Although, a few survived. And so if you look at that, the slide on the right there, you can see remnants of that in different places. And tonight, we're focusing on that area down there in the far bottom right-hand corner. And at first glance, when you walk through those areas and those preserves, it appears healthy, but it really isn't. And extensive research really pointed out that the oaks were very old, and the problem is that young oaks were not coming up underneath the understory. And on average, before we started the oak ecosystem recovery or the projects in that area, about 80% of the canopy was covered, or there was 85% coverage in that. And we found that just a reduction just down to a 65% cover, a really meaningful difference was made in that. And it created sort of a domino effect that not only do we see oaks naturally, new oaks naturally coming up, but everything else followed. And so the most noticeable thing is if you go out and in the spring and you see the wildflowers coming in, but it's bigger than that of that. Animals such as songbirds, butterflies, and a wide variety of understory vegetation really started to appear again after we started the project. And so, and how do we do this? With the voter support back in 2008, a bond referendum was passed, and that bond referendum, what 135 million of it was for land acquisition, and the rest of it was for restoration projects and public access projects. And then it really gave us the seed money so that we could match that with grants and donations. There were different projects that couldn't be met. So, the leadership of the Forest Preserve really believes that putting leadership in this area of restoration really goes to the key part of our overall mission. And so in 2013, more specifically, we began the Woodland Habitat Project by completing 196 acres of canopy and understory thinning at woodland communities at MacArthur Woods and Granger Woods Forest Preserve. Work continued at these preserves along the Des Plaines River area, and I'm going to turn this back over to Jim, that's been involved in that from the very beginning, to just give you an update on how those projects are going.
All right, thank you, Ty. I appreciate that. So one of the things that we looked at when we did our study was the first thing we did was go out and classify all of our woodlands. And so to really give you a real quick indication, oak communities vary. And they start with forests, which are about 60 to 100% cover. They have a dense canopy, and typically they're dominated by spring ephemeral forbs. Woodlands are about 25 to 60% cover. The trees are spread out a little bit more. There's an intermediate canopy density, and there's a mix of shrubs and forbs and grasses in the understory. In between that and the savanna, which is the next one, is northern flatwoods. And northern flatwoods are a very unique community in our woodlands. They are in depressional areas, and they typically sit on top of the moraines. If you're not familiar with the geology of Lake County, we have things what are called lake border moraines that are located north-south in between the Des Plaines River and Lake Michigan. And there's about 3 or 4 of them. And on top of these moraines are these little depressions where water stands. If you recall, I talked about the clay soil. The clay soil keeps the water from penetrating down into the subsurface. And so that water stays there until it evaporates away. And these northern flatwoods are like openings in the woodlands, and they are dominated by sedge meadow species. So a lot of grasses and sedges. And this is where a lot of amphibians and invertebrates produce copious amounts of life. And if you ever have a chance to go stand in a vernal pond and just take a glass jar, take a scoop of the water, you're not going to drink it. I guarantee you that, because you're going to see lots and lots of animals that are living in there. A little wider open is the savanna community, and this is about 10 to 25% cover. There's like 10 to 50 trees per hectare, which is 3 times an acre. These open conditions really lend to more of a grass-dominated understory, and so you see some of the species like big bluestem, or in some of our drier areas, little bluestem, encroaching upon our savanna community. And then finally, especially when you get out into the western part of Lake County, you start seeing really open savanna and barrens. And this is very typical of what we would call kettle moraine habitat. So Cuba Marsh is a good example, Grassy Lake, Gander Mountain, all the way up in the northwest corner, are all examples of open savanna barrens where fire would be a big dominant and keep those shrubs, those oaks, as little shrubs. Again, these were mostly stunted trees with a grass dominated ground layer. So I'd like to let you know that many of the oak species that are abundant in the Chicago region are adapted to live in fire dominated ecosystems. I think you all have seen images of Native Americans setting fire to the landscape. They did this for several reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute. But then during the European settlement, most of these oak ecosystems started to see less and less fire to where it became very uncommon. These woodlands started to become shaded by shade-tolerant species like ash, elm, and maples. This decreased the amount of sunlight getting to the woodland ground layer. And this is really, really important. When we looked at this project in 2008 as a bond referendum project, we had already gone through all of MacArthur Woods and taken out all of the invasive species, and we still were not seeing any restoration of the ground layer or any occurrence of oak species reproducing. And so that's because oak species are relatively shade intolerant. They need high light levels to grow, and typically they need about 30 to 50% to grow. So Native Americans always thought about these woodlands, and they had names for them. And I'm not going to try to say the name, but they were good woods and bad woods. And most of the woods were good because, one, you could see your enemy through it, but you also could see your prey through it. The bad woods were probably choked with raspberries and things along that line, and you could not see through them, and they considered those to be bad. And they burned them on a regular basis to keep them open, keep the oak trees going, keep the shrubs that would produce a lot of berries. And so, you know, since I mentioned since the time that the area started to get settled, we have really decreased our native oaks in the region. We've gone from 60% to 20% of the total basal area. Basal area is sort of the footprint of the tree. And so that's a significant decrease. We also have lack size and age class diversity. So we started sampling our sites, and what we saw was that we had all these really big trees and none of the young ones. And there was no representation of little baby trees, you know, youngsters, grade school, teenager, mid-age, you know, middle-aged, you know, my age, and then even the old ones were there, but there was no succession happening in our woodlands. And so this gave way to a lot of species that were non-native and opportunistic. So the maples, which are native, the elms, which are native, and ashes all started growing. They cannot resist fire. They have very thin bark compared to oak, which has a very thick corky bark, and oaks can withstand fires, but these other species can't. And so as we moved through this, we just started seeing a great decline in our oaks. And we're even more worrying now that we're going to lose this canopy. And if we lose the canopy, we're going to lose the trees that create those 10 million acorns, of which 10% survive. And so we were really looking at this system for regeneration of oak species, because we want to keep these communities around. They're very important. All those species that are dependent upon it are there. And so as we started to think about doing our effort, and you can see on the screen now, our Southern Des Plaines site, at the top is MacArthur Woods. There's Lloyd's and Daniel Wright Woods, Granger Woods, my favorite Elm Road Woods, which is a mix of upland forest and northern flatwoods. I did my major thesis on northern flatwoods. And then there's Ryerson. And then most recently, we've started some work down at Cahokia Flatwoods on the Lake Cook border. So if you drive along Lake Cook Road, you can see some of our clearing area. So, you know, we started looking at this in 2009, and we just found that 2 out of every 1,000 saplings counted were oaks. So they weren't reproducing. And the next generation of the keystone species just requires more sunlight. As I mentioned, we need about 30 to 50% light transmission to the ground level for growth. And these shade tolerant species were moving in and taking over. So we started with about 1,150 acres at those preserves. And we had a phased approach to this project. This wasn't just us going in saying, we know what to do, we're going to go in and do it. We actually set up research plots. There was several plots at each one of these preserves, and we did different treatments. So some treatments were very light thinning, and that increased the opening by 15 to 20%. Some places we did heavy thinning, which increased it to 30 to 40%. And then we did some really heavy clearing where we got it to 50 and 100%. And some of that we did by doing what we call openings or gaps, and we make circles in the woodlands and just clear out all the species. Now, this thinning and this clearing did include native oak, hickory, and other species. We just knew that we had to reduce the canopy. Most of the trees that were in the canopy were either maple, oaks, or hickories. And the thing that we really got, we didn't just think that we knew what we were doing. We worked with Dr. Robert Fahey from Morton Arboretum. We also consulted a forest ecologist from the Department of Conservation in Missouri, who had been researching this. And so we put our heads together and thought about this. And so there was a lot of things that we saw as benefits from this work. And one of the biggest ones that I would say is the return of native plants and animals. And I can't comment on how much we've been astounded by the response of these native systems without a lot of seeding and without a lot of manipulation beyond doing this opening of the canopy. And so if you take a walk this coming spring in Wright Woods or Ryerson or MacArthur Woods, you're going to see a plethora of native wildflowers. And what's missing right now is shrubs, and we need to reintroduce shrubs, but we couldn't do it with all this reduced sunlight. The shrubs will not survive. I was told once that buckthorn berries they're really bad for birds because they have very low nutrients and they're like laxatives. And so the birds eat them and then they depend upon them because that's like the only food that's out there. And then they go around and they defecate and they spread buckthorn. So buckthorn had its own means of spreading itself. Where if you compare with native shrubs and the fruit that are on viburnums, hazelnuts, they are really nutritious fruits and really are important for all of our bird species in our woodlands, savannas, and forests. We also have seen just tremendous responses of the hydrology in these sites. If you can imagine all the buckthorn and then all of these trees, they go through this process called evapotranspiration, and that's where they're taking water out of the ground, pumping it up into their leaves, and then it evaporates into the sky. Well, having all these trees there was really changing the hydrology of our woodlands. And so since we removed these, in one location, we did remove a former field tile, but for the most part, we've just taken out the buckthorn and these trees and the ponds, these vernal ponds I spoke of about in northern flatwoods, they also occur in some of our woodlands, started staying wetter longer throughout the year. And this is critically important for a lot of species that use these ponds that are free of fish to reproduce. So fairy shrimp, which I don't know if anybody's seen these are like little shrimp that swim upside down. And they're the cutest little things, and predaceous diving beetles are in these ponds. You never want to be bit by that one because it hurts. But there's also wood frogs, spring peepers, salamanders, all of these species are there. And Sarah's trying to keep up with me with the slides, and I'm going to make it go back because the birds are just as important. And so here you see a wood frog and a spotted salamander. The previous slide that she just flipped to shows a redheaded woodpecker, and those have come back in just unremarkable numbers. In fact, we did some public marketing with this process, and I forgot to mention that was probably the first step that we did. Even before I think Ty was here, we went through a very distinct process of figuring out how to share this message with people. And we developed a communication plan that we started out with our commissioners and informed them, started out with the local communities, and then went to the local homeowners and explained this process to them. So that communication process was really important. And part of it was installing some interpretive signs. And there's an interpretive sign for the redheaded woodpecker at Ryerson Woods. And I've been there several times, and every time I stand there and look at that interpretive sign, there's a redheaded woodpecker in the trees. So it's kind of one of those natural things that happens. And so, you know, the other things that happen is just the amount of wetland species that occur around these vernal ponds has just tremendously increased. We have species that are sedges that are called Carex tuckermania and Carex lupiformis, Carex intumescent. We're finding these species in new locations, not only as individuals, but as big populations. So we're seeing more diversity and we're seeing more large species. And the most important thing that we're seeing is the return of oak seedlings and saplings. And so we've restored the structure of this community, and if our efforts are assisting these species, and we're seeing really good response. And one of the things that we also noticed that in our old communities, before we started clearing, there was nothing growing on the ground. And so the ground was very susceptible to erosion. Jerry Wilhelm, who's a really famous ecologist, when he worked at still isn't a famous ecologist, but he worked at the Morton Arboretum, and they took pictures of this stone in the East Woods over years and years and years. And in 10 years time, they showed that there was 6 inches loss of topsoil. And so you've actually got down to the bottom 2 inches of the topsoil before you get to the clay. So having all these species on the ground provides protection from raindrops falling on the ground causing erosion, runoff, and it just holds and stores a lot more water. So it's really important to do this work, and we've learned some really important lessons. One of them was we wanted not to burn these systems because we were trying to see the response of these oaks, and we backed off on burning for like 5 years, and now we understand that that's not a good thing to do. We should have kept burning, and we really want to get back to that process. And so you'll probably see us burning more woodlands in the future. And these fires are really important. We burn in the spring and the fall when most animals are done breeding. A lot of animals are gone, and they move out of the fire. I'm not going to say we don't impact some of them, we do. And but it's really important to think about the biodiversity in total. And then the last thing I want to touch on before I turn it back over to Ty or Renee, you have to get which one, it's Ty, I'm sorry, is what we've done recently with an organization called City Forest Credits. And City Forest Credits has been working with us in Morton Arboretum to figure out a way to get us dollars for the reforestation we're doing. And this reforestation, we plant about 2,500 to 3,000 trees a year. And so City Forest Credits has found people that are looking to buy carbon credits on the voluntary market to increase the number of trees growing on the landscape. And a lot of people buy credits in the rainforest or out west in the large forest tracts, or up north in the upper peninsula of Michigan. But planting trees in our backyard has such an intensive impact upon our environment. It reduces the heat islands, it improves the air quality, they hold water, they purify water, and they provide habitat for a lot of species. So we have a big plant sale that we do every year, and we really encourage people to plant trees. But this process is actually getting us dollars for carbon sequestration that we're doing. And by having what we call these ecosystem betterments of air quality and things like that, we're allowed to go from like $25 a credit to $30 a credit. And so this market has really allowed us to start thinking about putting money into an endowment that Ty will talk about a little bit more here. But it's also a process that leads right into our 100-year vision and our roadmap to 2025. And so with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Ty and have him talk about that.
Thank you, Jim. And so, the larger plan here is that how do we actually get there is really it's our strategic plan. And we have a strategic plan that we worked on back in 2013. And what's interesting about our plan, which is 3 components of it, there's the vision, the 25-year strategic directions, and then the objectives, which are those short-term goals in the next 1 to 5 years. And so the vision, looking out 100 years, is actually not for the forest preserve, but it's for all of Lake County. It's for that other 80% of the land out there that is in some type of other ownership. And that's what we need to hit some really key components of our strategic plan. One of them is to have 4 10,000-acre ecological complexes. Why 10,000-acre complexes and 4 of them? Because that's what's needed in order to maintain the biodiversity as we know it now, let alone make improvements on it. Another key goal that we have in there is to have no further species loss. And another one is, an interesting one, is to have one of the 1,000-acre oak woodlands in the Chicago region here in Lake County. And in order to do those kind of things, you need to have a very long-term vision. And that's what ours is. It's 100 years. So if you think about it, if we planted an oak tree today, you know, really we're thinking about a couple of generations out. We're not thinking about ourselves. And that's the whole idea behind this plan. And the objectives, those really short-term goals in that how we move forward on this, they were updated since 2013, actually about 18 months ago. And that's our roadmap on to 2025. And that's when we're going to hit the 5 years on those. And we went from 13 and we went down to 4. We learned a lot the first time around. And this time, those 4 are steward healthy landscapes, strengthen connections, and then ensure our financial stability. And it's really around sustaining our organizational excellence. We can't do this without maintaining that excellence that we have right now. And so some key tactics in there, getting more specific, is looking at increasing the canopy in Lake County from 28 to 32%. And so that means planting a lot more trees out there and doing a lot more restoration. Another one is to restore an additional 2,400 acres of forest preserve land. And so there's another key one that 2,400 acres may not seem like a lot in the larger scheme there, but this is for the 5 years, and we're actually already a year into that. But also to emphasize that private public partnership. And that really goes to our endowment, and that's the sustainability piece. We can't do this without help from everybody. Literally, what we need is 700,000 residents working on this in order to maintain this biodiversity as we know it now. And so private funding, like we get from the Granger Foundation and other donors, we use that as matching dollars against dollars that we still have either in leftover from our 2008 bond referendum, or just in our general fund or our development fund. And that's really the key for us going forward, is that it's just a pie chart approach. And the endowment, what we do, our target for the endowment is 20 million. And that's very key, because that gives us about, when we hit that goal, gives us about $800,000 a year. But what we use that $800,000 for is to grow it hopefully to 1.6 million a year. And that's in perpetuity, and that it's there forever so we can continue to expand on this. And these endowment dollars go to some of those, preserves that we've already talked about, like Granger Woods, MacArthur Woods, Captain Daniel Wright Wood, where we've already made progress. But and looking at the larger scheme of things, looking out over that next 25 years in our strategic direction, this is the key piece right there. That's how we're going to move this forward. And so I guess with that, I would turn it back to you, Renee.
Okay, thanks, Ty. We've got some time for questions, and we've had a couple people submit them already. So why don't I start off? Jim, I've got a question for you around, are there any county mandates to plant oaks, or are we working with local towns and villages to achieve oak repopulation?
So we're doing a couple of things. So one project around Middle Fork Savannah is to try to increase the quality of the habitat around Middle Fork Savannah Forest Preserve. And so we're working on about a 2,900 acre block of land there with our buckthorn eradication project. It's a pilot project. We're trying to see how we can work with partners to work on these sites and to encourage the neighbors to do what we've done on Middle Fork Savannah. And that's to remove the buckthorn from their sites and replace it with something native. So that's one example. We kind of missed over this slide here. This is Ethel Woods Forest Preserve, which is up in the north central part of the county. Sarah and I shared this slide because we think it's a really good example. This was one of the parcels that we protected by acquiring with both bond referendum dollars and open land trust dollars from IDNR. And this is one of the largest woodland stands in the northern part of Lake County. So what you're seeing there is about 180 acres of what I would start to call more forested habitat. Most of the stuff along the southern plains is what we call woodland. And so this is a really unique opportunity for the Forest Preserve to provide protection. And then the final area that we're working on there's two areas, and I'll mention another one. Ryerson Woods, we've been working with the Morton Arboretum again to try to reach out to those neighbors. Many of the neighbors around Ryerson Woods has the same habitat as Ryerson Woods, which is wet. Everybody knows Riverwoods has actually implemented a program where they provide assistance to plant natives in and around people's yards. And so we've been working with them to try to encourage them to think about expanding the boundary of Ryerson Nature Preserve into their backyard, into their neighbor's backyard, and we get that Revlon commercial that's so on and so on and so on. And then finally, the Forest Preserve also has a native plant sale. We do one in the spring, and then we do another one in the fall. And so these have been very popular. A lot of organizations do them. And so we really try to encourage people. We provide them with education. We've also developed, working with the Morton Arboretum, the Healthy Landscapes brochure, Healthy Habitats brochure. There's a whole series of brochures that we've created for homeowners to think about working, changing their landscapes. We're also working with the Morton Arboretum through the Chicago Regional Tree Initiative to try to encourage communities to come up with ordinances that encourage the planting of native species, or at least more diverse plantings. Many of the communities in the region were really hit hard when the emerald ash borer came through and knocked out all their street trees. So everybody planted ash because they were quick growing, they looked nice, they provided a lot of shade, all important things. But at the same time, it left them open to this tragic event where they lost all their trees at one moment. And everybody knows that if you plant a tree in your backyard, it's not going to grow overnight. It takes years. And so we've been really trying to work with, as a member of the Chicago Regional Tree Initiative, to encourage communities to think about how they plant trees. So I hope that answers that question.
Actually, Jim, let's do a little bit of follow-up. We just had, I think that's tied to what you asked. Do you know of any funding for municipalities to remove buckthorn on their public lands in support of the forest preserves? This person, her hometown states that with COVID expenses, they don't have any funds to remove it.
So a lot of communities are probably experiencing that issue. You know, we are working with folks around Middle Fork, and we are cost sharing there, but that's not something that we can do across the county. And you know, I think Ty really thinks big, and one of the things that we really think about, you know, the forest, between the Forest Preserve and state and other landowners, we own about 25 to 26% of the landscape. But that other 80% that's out there is really, really important, and we need to figure out. So Ty and I have been thinking about how we could reach to some of these municipalities and talk to them and try to encourage that. A lot of this funding, you know, if you plant one tree this year and you plant another tree next year and you put some native plants in, you know, it just takes a couple of years to do. Getting communities to have funds available is a real difficult thing. There are some programs that have allowed things like replacing the ash trees, but you know, they're not really out there. And I think the way to do it is to try to get a plan for your property, think about how you can implement it, and implement it in stages. Plant your oak tree, plant the plants next to it, plant the hazelnuts, plant the May apples, and do it over time. I wish we had money to get buckthorn removed throughout the region. It's just really not something that could be done.
Oh, Ty?
Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit, in that, you know, what we're hoping for in our long-range strategic plan is that we get everybody educated on this and taking responsibility for their own landscape. I think that's the only way we can really accomplish this on the very long term, is that you know, we're all working toward a common goal. So like Jim, I wish we had you know a better answer for that, and that there was funding available, but ideally is that everybody works on it for their property. I think that's where we're going to make amazing progress on this.
Thanks, Ty. This is another one from the Q&A panel. And this is for Jim. So you talked about controlled burns. Can you talk a little bit about, do we leave dead oaks to decay naturally? How do we think about natural decomposition?
So I forgot to mention that as part of our Southern Des Plaines project, we did a process where what's called girdling the tree. And you sort of just put a circle around it and remove the outer bark. And that stops the flow of water up and down the tree and the nutrients. And so those trees stay and are serving as habitat for wildlife. When we do prescribe burns, we are not trying to set those trees on fire. Sometimes they do. If they're internal in the unit, the burn unit, and they're not going to fall in the trail or someone's yard, we let them stand. If they burn, they burn. If they don't, but we try to leave habitat both standing as we call them snags on the ground, and then logs laying on the ground are also really unique habitat. When I did my thesis study on the Flatwood Ponds, those areas actually would flood out some of the trees and they would fall. And there was an actual community sitting on top of the log where, these really rare species were growing and mosses. And so there's like a whole little community growing on top of the log that was just that much different than what was growing next to it. So those are all important, just as we need young oaks coming in, we also need those old oaks on the ground dying and producing more nutrients for the system.
Hey, Jim, we've got a question that just came into the Q&A. Not directly tied to oaks, but I think it's important. Does it help to let your grass grow a little longer before cutting and not cut it too short?
I always have my mower up about 4 inches. I love the feel of, bluegrass is really nice. It's a terrible thing. I don't have much of my yard. It takes me 15 minutes to mow my grass because I have mostly natives planted in my back and front yard. But I really do like the feel of bluegrass during the summer running through my toes. And I like it to be like I'm going back to my hippie days, sorry. I like it to be shag carpet-like. And so the less you mow, the less that you're going to be using your lawnmower, putting carbon in the air. Those lawns, when the bluegrass gets thick like that, it tends to be able to outcompete dandelions and crabgrass. So, it is good to let the grass grow. And I would encourage everybody to think about planting, more native gardens in their backyard. I love my backyard because it changes every season. Things move around. I don't really need to put bird feeders out. The plants provide the food for the birds, and especially in the fall when everything goes to seed, my backyard is the plethora of birds. And so, we had one staff member recently, she did put up a hummingbird feeder and had a Mexican hummingbird come to her backyard. And so she shared that, and a lot of people ran over and saw that species. So you don't know what you're going to see in your backyard, but if there's no habitat there and all you got is grass, grass is just like concrete. Once it rains and saturates the root system, all the rest of the water that hits that spot runs off and down into the street, into the curb, into the stream, and causes more flooding. You have native plants and you have taller grass that absorbs a lot more water.
Hey, Jim, I think a lot of what you said answers this question, but I want to ask it, just if there's anything you want to add, is how can private owners preserve and protect their property?
So there's a couple of ways. If you have a large enough property, you can set it into a conservation easement if you want. Another way is to Open Lands, which is an organization out of Chicago, has conservation at home program. They will provide you technical guidance for a small fee on how to change your yard, and they can designate it. You can put a deed restriction on it, a conservation easement. The IDNR has a set aside program for wildlife friendly backyards, and so there's ways that you can do that. I would look, the Forest Preserve really can't provide those local conservation easements. Open Lands can, the Citizens for Conservation down in the Barrington area, Lake Forest Open Lands, in Lake Forest, Lake Bluff Open Lands, Patawa Open Lands. Libertyville Township Open Space is another area. So, we're very unique in Lake County that we have a lot of partners that are trying to do the same thing on a different scale. Some are communities, some are townships, and then there's the Forest Preserve.
I think we did have a question around, is there a nonprofit the Forest Preserve partners with, like the CFC? And I would say the Preservation Foundation is the nonprofit that's sponsoring this today. So that we're actually the main source, the main nonprofit that works with the Forest Preserve. So please feel free to join us. We're always looking for help.
Right. And those funds from the Preservation Foundation are critically important to form other partnerships. So we have received foundation dollars to look at rusty patch bumblebee, which is a federally listed species. We got some money to hire somebody that used to work for the Natural History Survey, one of the best bumblebee experts in the state. And she was able to go out to several sites and look for bumblebees this year and next year and the following year. And so that's a way that we were working with Citizens for Conservation. It also helps, the foundation has been sort of an administrator of grants for the Illinois, let me straighten myself out, the Chewauquee Prairie Illinois Beach Lake Plain Partnership, which is really not a nonprofit. It's not an organization. It's just 14 partners that have been working together for 15 years, bringing in about $14 million to Illinois Beach, Spring Bluff, and Chewauquee Prairie. And the foundation has been very important as acting as a financial resource, processing those funds and working with those partners. So we believe that partnerships and collaboration are really, really important. In fact, in the last week, I mentioned to Ty that I heard this really important thing on this in the ecosystem marketplace, where they're really encouraging all the agencies that work in the county to meet on a regular basis and discuss projects that are coming up so that they can pool their resources and pool their needs, so that they're trying to think about how we can implement green infrastructure. And so, the foundation is a really important resource for doing that. They provided money to the Des Plaines River Watershed Work Group. That group was out sampling the streams in the Des Plaines River. We came along and the foundation put money up, almost $45,000, to actually sample the headwater streams of all those streams that the partnership wasn't going to be able to get at. And now we have that great database set there, that baseline data that tells us about where we should be working at in the headwaters. So partnerships are really critical to us. And I think that's another thing that's in our roadmap to 2025.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I think that kind of closes out our Q&A session. Jim, Ty, did you have any closing remarks before I close this out?
Oh, just thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
It was a great time. So thank you both, Ty and Jim. I learned. I hope everyone else did too. As a Preservation Foundation board member, I'm proud to work with the Forest Preserves. I'm really proud of all that they've done over the past 60 years. You can get involved in whatever way and at whatever level that's meaningful for you. If you want to take local action on climate change to protect air in Lake County, you can start with your own acre, as we talked about. Consider planting native oaks or other native trees in your own yard. To increase the tree canopy to 32%, we need homeowners planting oaks along with us. You can purchase native trees and other shrubs during the native plant sale. It's all online and it's going to begin in the spring. You can also help restore one or more of your favorite preserves. We welcome volunteers all year round. Those controlled burns are lots of fun, right, Jim? And to help with the restoration management. Or you can support all 31,000 acres of the Forest Preserves with a gift to the Preservation Foundation. Every gift matters because every gift helps the Forest Preserves do more. You can adopt an oak tree, an acre, or even a part of a trail. Please, you can visit lcfpd.org/donate. Or, and Sarah, if you're good with me giving your number here, Sarah at 847-968-3448. Thanks again for joining us today. Please look for more information for our upcoming final episode of this 3-part webinar series, Wrong Roots. Have a great evening and please stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Renee.
Hey, thank you. Really nice job, Sarah. So
Did amazing. I'm just looking through to see if there's any questions here that I can follow up with later. But
we did
yeah,
have a nice person who volunteered their house for work, and I know we've got still some attendees on the line, but you might want to take a look at that one. So
yeah, no, it's a good one.
sounds like a beautiful house. So
Oh, yeah.
cool. Well, have a wonderful night.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi to Butter.
Will do. She's looking right here.
Oh. Have a good night. Thanks again. Saving the chats here real quick.
Okay.
Just to make sure. Okay.
You guys are outstanding.
Nice job. Thank you
Good job.
so much.
Really nice job.
I think I saved the chats. It said it's saved.
Takes a little while to say.
Yeah. Really well done. Especially.
Right on time too, aren't we?
Right on time. Even a couple minutes early.
6:57. Yeah.
Figure it out.
Yeah, I hit record. I'm just afraid to end before.
That's how you save the recording.
I'm still just FYI. Let me stop my camera real quick. Okay.
Go to more and see if it says save.
It says stop recording. So I'm gonna try that.